The pyramids stand silent against the desert sky, but their greatest secret is not in the stone. It is in the bread. Imagine the effort to build them, a feat of engineering that has captivated us for millennia. Yet that engineering pales before a more fundamental human puzzle. How do you feed an army of laborers, tens of thousands strong, in a place with no farms, in a time with no trucks? This was the central, crushing logistical challenge behind every ancient megaproject. We remember the monuments, but we have forgotten the supply chains that made them possible. By the end of this exploration, you will understand the ingenious, empire-spanning systems that turned harvests into rations and grain into history. We will uncover how administrators tracked every loaf, how rivers became highways for barley, and how a worker's daily meal was the currency of power. What does it truly take for a civilization to marshal its most basic resource, food, to achieve the impossible? The numbers themselves are a monument to human ambition. For the Great Pyramid, estimates suggest a workforce of 20 to 30,000 individuals during the peak building season. This was not a small town of artisans. It was a temporary city of laborers, all of whom needed to eat, drink, and be sheltered far from their own fields and homes. The logistical pressure this created was not a minor detail. It was the single most demanding problem the project's overseers had to solve every single day for decades. Let's break down what that truly meant. An active adult laborer in that environment would require around 3,000 calories daily just to sustain the grueling physical work. That means the project required a minimum of 60 million calories every single day. To put that in modern terms, it is the equivalent of providing over 100,000 large loaves of bread every morning without fail. And that is just the food. Each person also needed at least 2 liters of water, totaling over 50,000 liters daily, all hauled into the arid plateau. Then there was the fuel, wood or charcoal, needed to bake that mountain of bread and prepare other meals. This created a relentless, voracious demand that never paused, a constant pull on the kingdom's agricultural heartland along the Nile. This demand transformed food from a simple necessity into the central currency of the megaproject. A missed shipment did not just mean hungry workers. It meant a complete halt to construction, a breakdown of order, and a direct threat to the pharaoh's divine mandate. The entire administration of Egypt had to be recalibrated to serve this one purpose, creating a kind of early command economy where grain was collected, stored, shipped, and distributed with military precision. The true foundation of the pyramid, therefore, was not the first layer of limestone, but this vast, invisible, and perfectly orchestrated river of sustenance. But who could possibly orchestrate such a colossal, daily symphony of supply? The answer was not found in the quarries or on the ramps, but in quiet, shaded rooms filled with papyrus. To turn the chaos of feeding thousands into a predictable system required a revolution in organization itself. This gave rise to the world's first true bureaucracies, a class of administrators whose power was measured not in stone but in ledgers. At the very top, figures like the Egyptian vizier acted as the kingdom's chief operating officer. His primary responsibility was not foreign policy or warfare, but domestic logistics, ensuring the granaries of the Nile Delta were full and that their contents flowed uninterrupted to the royal worksites. Beneath him stretched a pyramid of overseers, each managing a smaller piece of the puzzle, from regional grain collection to the distribution of loaves at the work camp bakery. The true muscle of this system, however, was the scribe. Armed with a reed brush and a palette of inks, the scribe was the human equivalent of a data server. His role was to record everything, every sack of barley received from a village, every bushel stored in a state granary, every shipment sent up the Nile, and every daily ration issued to a work crew was meticulously noted. These were not simple lists, they were complex accounting documents that tracked origins, quantities, qualities, and destinations. In Mesopotamia, temple administrators performed a similar function, using cuneiform tablets to log the yields from vast temple-owned estates, calculating exactly how much grain could be diverted to feed laborers building ziggurats or city walls. This constant, granular record-keeping transformed food from a perishable commodity into a manageable resource. It allowed planners to forecast needs, identify shortfalls before they became crises, and hold local officials accountable for their contributions. The administrative backbone turned the impossible math of mass feeding into a routine, if monumental, paperwork exercise. It was the quiet, relentless work of these countless scribes, their hands stained with ink rather than stone dust, that truly kept the wheels of empire turning. These meticulous records pointed to a single, critical destination. The grain did not flow directly from farm to worksite. It moved through a network of secure, state-controlled storage hubs. Across the ancient world, the most powerful tool a ruler possessed was not a sword, but a granary. These were not simply sheds for holding surplus. They were the empire's strategic reserves, the foundational nodes in a vast logistical web. Their design was a marvel of practical engineering, built first and foremost for preservation. In Egypt, granaries were often dome-shaped structures made of mud brick, with raised floors to guard against dampness and infestations. Small openings near the top allowed for careful ventilation, while sealed doors protected the contents. In Mesopotamia, massive, thick-walled storerooms attached to temples and palaces served the same vital function. The goal was to arrest time itself, to keep barley, emmer wheat, and other staples edible for years, not just months. This transformed food from a seasonal, fleeting resource into a permanent, deployable asset of the state. Placement was everything. You find these granaries consistently positioned at two key points, along major waterways like the Nile, the Tigris, or the Euphrates, and at administrative centers or near large population hubs. A riverside location was a logistical masterstroke. It meant that grain collected as tax from distant provinces could be loaded onto barges and floated downstream with minimal effort, converging at these storage points. From there, it could be redistributed up or down the river as needed. A granary near a city or a permanent royal estate ensured a ready supply for the local population, but more importantly, it created a stockpile that could be tapped at a moment's notice for state projects. This system performed a crucial economic function. It smoothed out the brutal uncertainty of ancient life. Harvests failed, droughts happened, seasons varied. By collecting a portion of every harvest into these central reserves, the state created a buffer against famine for its people. But this humanitarian function was inseparable from its power function. That same buffer guaranteed that when the pharaoh or the king decreed a new monument, there was already a mountain of food waiting to be mobilized. The granary system turned the episodic rhythm of agriculture into a steady, predictable stream of calories that could be directed anywhere at any time. It was the beating heart of the empire, quietly pumping sustenance to its most ambitious extremities. But all that stored grain had to come from somewhere. This leads us to the quiet, sun-baked fields far from the grand construction sites, where the system truly began. The engine that filled those vast granaries was not built on gold or silver, but on a simple, universal principle, the tax in kind. For the average farmer in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, the might of the state arrived not as a soldier, but as a scribe with a measuring rope and a ledger. His obligation was not paid in coins, a concept that did not yet exist for most of these societies, but in the literal fruits of his labor. A significant portion of his annual harvest, often calculated as a fixed share or based on the land's assessed yield, was collected directly by royal or temple officials. This was a brilliantly efficient system for its time. It converted the diffuse, sprawling agricultural surplus of an entire kingdom into a centralized, movable resource without the complications of a monetary economy. The state did not have to sell grain to buy labor. It simply converted grain directly into labor. Think of it as the ultimate barter system on a civilizational scale. A farmer's barley was his tax payment, and that same barley, once stored in a state granary, became the ration for a mason working on a pyramid hundreds of miles away. This direct conversion bypassed markets, merchants, and price fluctuations, giving the ruling authority absolute control over a fundamental resource. For the farmer, this system created a predictable, if heavy, burden. He knew what portion of his crop was owed, regardless of its final use. For the state, it provided a transparent and tangible revenue stream. Officials could physically see and measure the wealth of the nation as it poured into storage, sack by sack. This method also had a stabilizing effect on the broader economy. By removing a large, consistent portion of grain from local circulation every year, the state helped prevent catastrophic gluts that could crash the value of a harvest and ruin farmers. Of course, a poor harvest meant hardship for everyone. The farmer had less to eat and the state had less to distribute, which is why those granary buffers were so vital. The tax-in-kind system wove every agricultural producer directly into the fabric of imperial ambition. It meant that a farmer tending his field along the Nile, though he might never see the rising pyramid, was intrinsically connected to its creation. His sweat and soil were quite literally the foundation upon which the stones were stacked, transformed by an administrative alchemy that turned bushels of wheat into monuments meant to last for eternity. The ledgers were clear, the granaries were full, but a mountain of grain sitting by a riverbank is useless to a hungry worker on a distant plateau. This is where the true genius of ancient logistics reveals itself, not in the counting, but in the moving. The empires that built wonders understood a fundamental truth of their world, that water was the only practical highway for moving mass quantities of anything. A single wooden barge floating peacefully down the Nile with the current could carry the grain equivalent of thousands of donkey loads. Overland transport by animal caravan was achingly slow, expensive, and limited by the need to feed the animals themselves, who would consume a significant portion of the cargo they carried. A journey that might take weeks by land with constant risk of spoilage and loss could be accomplished in days by river. This staggering difference in efficiency made rivers like the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and China's Yellow River the absolute lifelines of empire. They were not just sources of water for irrigation, they were the pulsating arteries through which the lifeblood of the state, its food surplus, could flow. To control the river was to control the kingdom's capacity for greatness. This understanding sparked massive state investment in hydraulic infrastructure. Royal administrations did not just use the rivers, they actively sculpted them to serve their logistical needs. They built and maintained extensive networks of canals that branched off from the main waterways like capillaries, reaching deeper into agricultural heartlands to collect grain more directly. They constructed fortified docks and harbors at strategic points, turning sleepy riverbanks into bustling ports where scribes could tally incoming shipments and overseers could organize the next leg of the journey. In Egypt, the journey to the Giza plateau famously involved a specially built canal that brought barges from the Nile right to the base of the construction site, a monumental public works project in its own right. The barges themselves were state assets, built to standardized designs for stability and capacity, operated by crews who were as vital to the project as any stonecutter. This riverine system created a rhythm to empire. In Egypt, the annual inundation of the Nile dictated the construction calendar. When the floodwaters rose, farming ceased, and that vast agricultural workforce became available for state labor. At the same time, the high water made river transport easier and faster, perfectly synchronizing the availability of manpower with the delivery of their sustenance. The river did not just carry grain, it carried time, order, and imperial will, connecting the fertile mud of the delta directly to the soaring ambition of the desert monuments. Without these liquid highways, the administrative records would have been mere wish lists, and the granaries nothing more than isolated silos of potential. The river made the system fluid, dynamic, and alive. Even the greatest rivers, however, had to end somewhere. For a construction site like the Giza Plateau, or for projects far from any major waterway, the final stage of the journey was the most grueling and inefficient of all. This was the Overland challenge, where the smooth, effortless flow of river barges gave way to the slow, laborious trudge of feet and hooves. Once the grain was unloaded at the nearest dock or canal terminus, it faced a landscape of dust, heat, and gravity. The primary engines for this final leg were donkeys and human porters, each with severe logistical limitations. A single donkey could carry perhaps 100 kilograms, but it also needed to eat and drink, consuming a portion of the very cargo it transported on any journey longer than a day or two. Human porters, while more versatile on rough terrain, faced the same fundamental equation. The energy they expended carrying food had to be less than the energy the food provided, or the entire system collapsed into absurdity. This harsh math imposed a strict, invisible radius around every river port, a zone beyond which supplying a large workforce became exponentially more difficult and costly. To overcome this, ancient logisticians turned to scale and organization. They did not send individual donkeys, they assembled massive caravan trains. Imagine a line stretching toward the horizon, hundreds of sturdy donkeys, each laden with identical sacks of grain or jars of water, led by experienced handlers and guarded by a few soldiers. This was a supply column, a moving conveyor belt of calories. Its success depended on meticulous planning. The distance to the worksite had to be divided into manageable daily segments, each ending at a predetermined stopping point. This necessity gave birth to another critical piece of infrastructure, the way station. Along these overland supply routes, administrators established simple but vital outposts. A way station provided basic shelter for the drivers, water and fodder for the animals, and secure storage to protect the cargo overnight. These were the desert's equivalent of roadside service centers, ensuring the caravan could resume its journey at first light without needing to return to the river. In some cases, for truly monumental projects, the state went even further, constructing paved roads or clearing wide paths to ease the movement of these trains and reduce travel time. The entire operation was a ballet of timing and redundancy. Caravans would be dispatched on a rotating schedule so that the worksite received a continuous stream of supplies, never waiting for one empty train to return before the next full one arrived. It was a system built on the understanding that while the river did the heavy lifting, the final mile would always be a slog, a relentless, dusty procession where every loaf of bread earned its place on the worker's plate through a symphony of grit and coordination. At the end of that dusty caravan trail, the grain finally reached its ultimate purpose. It was transformed into the single most important tool of management in the ancient world, the standardized daily ration. For the vast majority of laborers on these megaprojects, this was not a supplemental benefit, it was their entire paycheck. Their work was compensated not with coins, but with a guaranteed share of the state's most vital resource, food. This system was a masterpiece of practical psychology and control. By providing a consistent, predictable allotment of sustenance, the administration eliminated the daily anxiety of survival, freeing the worker to focus entirely on his assigned task. It also bound him directly to the state. His well-being was now inextricably linked to the continued flow of supplies from the central granaries. The composition of this edible salary tells us exactly what it took to fuel a civilization's ambitions. In Egypt, the foundational element was always bread, a dense, nutritious loaf made from emmer wheat or barley. But the ration was far more than just carbohydrates. Archaeological evidence, especially from well-documented worker villages like Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, reveals a surprisingly balanced and thoughtful diet. Alongside their bread, workers regularly received portions of beer, which was not merely an intoxicant but a safe, nutritious source of calories and vitamins in a world with uncertain water supplies. They were allotted onions, garlic, and pulses like lentils for essential minerals and flavor. Fish from the Nile, either fresh or salted and dried, provided crucial protein. On special occasions or as rewards for exceeding quotas, the ration might be supplemented with dates, cakes, or even small cuts of meat. This was not a feast, but it was a reliable, sustaining menu designed for hard labor. The genius of the system lay in its standardization and meticulous accounting. At Deir el-Medina, Ostraca, which are pottery shards used as notepads, record in minute detail the exact amounts issued to each worker, often varying by skill level and role. A foreman might receive a larger share or more desirable items than a junior laborer, creating a clear hierarchy of reward within the workforce itself. This consistency was the key to social stability. A worker who knew his family would be fed, regardless of the season or the success of distant harvests, was a worker less likely to protest or abandon the site. The ration system transformed the abstract power of the pharaoh into something tangible and daily, delivered directly into the worker's hands. It was a silent, powerful contract, a promise of security in exchange for monumental effort. Every loaf of bread broken at the worksite was a direct transaction, converting the kingdom's agricultural wealth into physical labor, one meal at a time. This same principle of mobile sustenance was being perfected in another, far more urgent theater of operation. The relentless needs of a marching army created a laboratory for logistics, one that would directly inform how empires fed their monumental construction sites. An army on campaign faced the ultimate supply chain nightmare, thousands of men moving rapidly through unknown or hostile territory, far from the secure granaries of home. Their survival, and thus the success of the entire campaign, depended on solving the same core puzzle. How do you deliver vast quantities of food to a constantly shifting point of consumption? The solutions they pioneered became a playbook for civilian administrators. The most immediate and often most destructive method was foraging. A large force would spread out, essentially harvesting the land it moved through, commandeering grain from local villages, herds from pastures, and anything else edible. While effective in the short term, this was a strategy of desperation. It ravaged the countryside, turned local populations against the army, and was utterly unsustainable in barren or already depleted regions. A smarter, more controlled approach mirrored the granary system, but on the move. This was the concept of pre-positioned supply depots. Before a campaign even began, scouts and advance parties would identify strategic points along the intended route, often at river crossings or fortified towns. There, the state would stockpile food, fodder, and equipment, sometimes by shipping it ahead via river or by taxing local areas in advance. The army, then, was not a wandering scavenger, but a force moving from one secured pantry to the next. The Roman military mastered this art, establishing a network of fortified camps and supply bases that allowed their legions to operate deep into enemy territory with a reliability that itself became a weapon of psychological warfare. But between these depots, the army still had to eat. This gave rise to the most iconic symbol of military logistics, the baggage train. This was a mobile city of carts, pack animals, and camp followers dedicated solely to carrying the army's life support system. Managing this train was a tactical discipline in itself. It had to be large enough to carry sufficient supplies for the gaps between depots, but not so large or slow that it became a vulnerable hindrance to the army's movement. The parallels to the caravans supplying a pyramid site are direct and profound. Both required meticulous calculation of daily consumption rates, travel distances, and the carrying capacity of animals who themselves consumed a portion of the cargo. The organizational hierarchy was nearly identical, from the quartermaster general down to the teamster driving a single ox cart. The relentless, rhythmic movement of supplies had to be perfectly synchronized with the progress of the main body, whether that body was a legion on the march or a workforce on a plateau. The critical insight for civilian projects was this: a major construction site was not so different from a stationary army. It was a large, concentrated population that could not feed itself, located in a place without natural abundance. The administrators of megaprojects simply adopted the military model of planned depots and scheduled convoys, but applied it to a fixed destination. The worker village became the permanent fortified camp. The way stations along the desert trail became the simplified versions of military supply bases. The rotating donkey caravans were the civilian baggage train, running on a loop instead of a line of advance. By studying how empires kept their soldiers fed in the field, we uncover the blueprint for how they kept their builders fed at the stone. It was all one system, a single philosophy of power expressed through the meticulous management of hunger. Rome took this concept of state-managed food and scaled it to an entirely new purpose. The system was called the Annona, and its goal was not to build monuments, but to maintain peace in the heart of an empire. At its peak, the city of Rome was home to over 1 million people, a staggering concentration of humanity that could never be fed by the surrounding Italian countryside alone. This created a permanent, volatile logistical crisis. A hungry urban population was a restless one, a direct threat to political stability. The Roman solution was audacious. They would feed the city not from its hinterlands but from the entire Mediterranean. The Annona began as an occasional measure, a distribution of subsidized grain to placate the poor during shortages. But over time, it evolved into a permanent, enormous entitlement, a right of citizenship for hundreds of thousands of male residents. This was the world's first large-scale urban welfare system, and it was powered entirely by imperial logistics. Every month, eligible citizens would present a token at a designated distribution point and receive a monthly ration of unmilled wheat, enough to bake bread for a family. The psychological impact was profound. It transformed the relationship between the citizen and the state, creating a direct, tangible dependency. The emperor was no longer a distant ruler. He was the provider of the daily loaf. This was power exercised not through fear, but through the stomach, a brilliant strategy of social control that traded bread for order on a metropolitan scale. To fulfill this promise, Rome had to master geography. The grain that filled the sacks at the distribution points came from oceans away. The fertile fields of Egypt, conquered by Augustus, became the personal breadbasket of Rome. Every year, a vast fleet of specially designed grain ships, some capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of wheat, would set sail from Alexandria. They followed the predictable rhythms of the winds and currents, their holds packed with the harvest taxed from the Nile Valley. Another critical supply line stretched across the Mediterranean from the provinces of North Africa, modern-day Tunisia and Libya. These two sources created a redundant lifeline, ensuring that a crop failure in one region would not starve the capital. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that by the 2nd century, Rome was importing over 150,000 tons of grain annually just for the Annona. This required a constant shuttle of ships, a maritime conveyor belt that turned the Mediterranean into a Roman highway for calories. The operation demanded a navy to protect the routes from pirates, a corps of skilled mariners, and a deep understanding of seasonal sailing patterns. It was a logistical undertaking that dwarfed the supply chains of any single construction project because it was permanent, it was relentless, and the consequences of failure were not a delayed temple, but riots in the streets. All of this grain converged on a single, engineered point, the Port of Ostia. Located at the mouth of the Tiber River, Ostia was transformed from a small town into the bustling, specialized gateway to Rome. When the grain ships arrived, they could not sail up the shallow Tiber to the city itself. Instead, they docked at Ostia's massive warehouses, the Horia. These were not simple sheds, but monumental, multi-story brick and concrete structures designed for security and efficiency. They had raised floors for ventilation, thick walls to regulate temperature, and were guarded by imperial troops. Here, the grain was unloaded, inspected, and measured by a small army of clerks and port officials. It was then transferred to a fleet of smaller, flat-bottomed river barges for the final, slow journey up the Tiber to Rome's own storage complexes, like the vast Horia Galbi near the Aventine Hill. The entire process, from ship to barge to central warehouse to distribution point, was a choreographed ballet of handling and accounting. The Annona demonstrated a logistical maturity that earlier empires could only dream of. It was a system that integrated naval power, provincial administration, civil engineering, and public welfare into a single, seamless operation. It showed that the ultimate expression of imperial power was not just the ability to build colossal structures, but to sustain colossal cities, to turn the agricultural wealth of conquered lands into the quiet, daily peace of an urban populace. In doing so, Rome proved that the most sophisticated megaproject of all was the maintenance of society itself. The Roman Annona required a sea to function, but some empires had to build their supply chains across the very roof of the world. Far from the flat river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Inca Empire faced a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. Their domain was the Andes, a landscape of jagged peaks, deep ravines, and thin air, stretching over 2,500 miles from modern-day Colombia to Chile. In this vertical world, the wheel was useless and pack animals were limited to shore-footed llamas, which could not carry heavy loads, to feed massive armies, sustain far-flung administrative centers, and mobilize labor for their own terraced cities and mountaintop citadels. The Inca engineered a system that turned geography itself into an asset. Their secret was a network so integrated and resilient that it functioned without a single written record, relying instead on physical infrastructure and memorized data. At the heart of this system were three brilliant innovations: a road network that defied the mountains, a communication web of human runners, and a scattered treasury of food that could last for years. The foundation was the qullqas, the royal road. This was not a single path but a vast, interconnected web of highways and trails, meticulously engineered and maintained by the state. Imagine a stone-paved highway clinging to a cliff face 4,000 meters high, or a suspension bridge woven from grass fibers spanning a roaring river gorge. The Incas built these. They constructed stairways up near vertical slopes, cut tunnels through solid rock, and laid drainage channels to prevent washouts. This network, totaling over 25,000 miles, was the empire's central nervous system. It was designed for foot traffic, with rest houses called tambos placed at intervals of about 20 kilometers, a day's walk for a laden porter or a military unit. These roads were not for public travel, they were state property, reserved for the movement of imperial troops, administrators, and most critically, supplies. Without carts or heavy beasts of burden, the burden of transport fell entirely on human backs. A class of professional porters, organized through the Incas' labor tax system known as the mitre, would carry goods in manageable loads using tumplines across their foreheads. While slow by modern standards, this method was perfectly adapted to the terrain. allowing supplies to flow reliably where no wheeled vehicle could ever go. Speed, however, was still essential for command and control. For urgent messages, small luxury items, or fresh seafood for the emperor's table from the distant coast, the Inca relied on the chasquis system. This was a relay network of highly trained runners stationed in pairs at small huts along the main roads, always within sight of the next post. When a runner approached with a message, the next runner would hear his conch shell trumpet, step out ready, receive the verbal message or the knotted cord record called a qullqas, and immediately sprint to the next station. In this way, a message could travel up to 240 kilometers in a single day, a speed unmatched anywhere in the pre-Columbian world. This instant communication allowed the central government in Cusco to know about harvests, troop movements, or rebellions in real time, enabling them to direct the flow of resources with astonishing responsiveness. The chasquis were the living, breathing internet of the Inca Empire, turning vast distances into manageable information loops. Information was useless, though, without the physical resources to act on it. This is where the Inca system achieved its true genius in the qullqas. These were state storehouses, thousands of them, built on hillsides above major administrative centers and along the road network. Their strategic placement on slopes provided natural ventilation, keeping the contents cool and dry. Inside these warehouses, the Incas stored the empire's wealth, which was overwhelmingly agricultural. The most famous stockpile was chuño, freeze-dried potatoes. Andean communities would lay potatoes out to freeze on cold, high-altitude nights, then trample them to squeeze out the moisture and let them dry in the sun. This process created a lightweight, durable food that could be stored for up to 10 years without spoiling. Qullqas also held vast quantities of quinoa, dried maize, jerky from llama and alpaca, and even dried fish from the coast. This network of storage created a distributed safety net. A region suffering a poor harvest could draw on supplies from a neighboring valley's qullqas, preventing famine and maintaining stability. More importantly, it allowed the state to concentrate resources wherever they were needed most, whether to feed an army assembling for a campaign, to supply laborers building a new terrace system, or to provide for the populace during religious festivals. The qullqas transformed the unpredictable yields of mountain agriculture into a permanent, movable feast entirely under state control. They were the empire's battery, storing the energy of the sun and soil for future use. The entire system, from road to runner to warehouse, was coordinated without a single written word. Instead, administrators used the qullqas, a complex device of knotted strings where the position, type, and number of knots encoded numerical data, likely recording census figures, tax obligations, and warehouse inventories. Trained specialists, the qullqas, could read and interpret these codes, creating a portable, durable database. This highlights a profound truth about ancient logistics. The system is more important than the script. The Inca state was a masterpiece of organization, using physical infrastructure and communal memory to achieve a level of integration that rivaled empires with centuries of written bureaucracy. They looked at a landscape of impossible barriers and saw a matrix of connection, proving that the will to distribute resources could literally move mountains. All those intricate systems of collection and transport would have been meaningless if the grain spoiled in transit. The true, silent partner in every ancient supply chain was not an administrator or a scribe, but time itself. To defeat decay, to preserve the vital energy of a summer harvest for consumption months or even years later, required a deep, practical understanding of preservation science. Ancient cultures became masters of manipulating their environment to halt the natural processes of rot, using techniques that were simple in concept but revolutionary in impact. Their goal was to remove one of three things that all spoilage agents need: water, air, or warmth. In the arid climates of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the sun itself was the primary tool. The drying of grains, fruits, fish, and meat was a universal practice. By drastically reducing moisture content, they created an environment where bacteria and mold could not thrive. Dates, figs, and grapes were sun-dried into durable, sweet concentrates of energy. Fish from the Nile or the Mediterranean were split open, salted, and laid on racks under the blazing sun, transforming into a lightweight, protein-rich staple that could fuel a worker or a soldier for months. This process of desiccation was the first and most crucial line of defense, turning perishable bounty into stable, shippable commodities. But for items that could not be fully dried or to add another layer of protection, ancient innovators turned to chemistry. Salting was a particularly powerful method, used extensively for meat and fish. Salt draws out moisture through osmosis, creating a hypersaline environment that is lethal to most microbes. Across the Roman world, vast salt pans produced the mountains of salt needed to preserve the bacon and fish that fed legions. Smoking combined the drying effect of heat with the antimicrobial properties of compounds found in wood smoke, adding flavor while creating a protective barrier on the food's surface. Perhaps the most ingenious preservation method, however, was one that harnessed microbial life rather than fighting it: fermentation. This was not merely about creating alcoholic drinks, it was a fundamental food preservation technology. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the fermentation of barley into beer did more than provide a safe, nutritious beverage. The brewing process itself sterilized the water used, and the final product, with its low pH and alcohol content, resisted further spoilage far better than the original grain. In Rome and across Southeast Asia, the fermentation of fish guts and small fish in salt produced garum or fish sauce, a pungent, protein-rich liquid that could be stored for years in sealed amphorae, adding vital flavor and nutrients to a monotonous grain-based diet. These techniques transformed local, seasonal gluts into national, perennial assets. A sudden massive catch of fish from the Nile did not have to be eaten immediately or wasted. It could be salted, dried, and added to the state's strategic reserves to be doled out with the daily bread ration at a distant worksite. The preservation method also dictated the packaging. The humble ceramic jar or amphora was the ancient world's shipping container. These sturdy vessels, often sealed with clay or resin stoppers and sometimes lined with pitch, created an anaerobic environment that protected their contents from air and pests. Thousands of these uniform jars, filled with olive oil, wine, fish sauce, or dried fruit, could be stacked efficiently in the holds of ships or in warehouse storerooms, their shapes designed for stability in transit. On land, the design of granaries showcased a sophisticated grasp of passive climate control. Whether the mud brick silos of Egypt or the raised, ventilated horia of Rome, these structures were engineered to combat heat and humidity. Their thick walls provided thermal mass, keeping the interior cool during the day. Raised floors prevented ground moisture from seeping upward, and clever ventilation systems, like small openings near the roof, allowed warm, moist air to escape while drawing in drier air, preventing the condensation that could trigger mold. This was preservation architecture, buildings designed as machines for stopping time. Every one of these methods, from the smoky hearth to the sealed amphora to the ventilated granary, served a single logistical purpose: to decouple consumption from harvest. They created a buffer of time, allowing the slow, steady rhythm of ox carts and river barges to function. Without this mastery of preservation, the grain taxed from a village in the spring would never have reached the pyramid site by autumn, and the entire edifice of imperial ambition would have crumbled into mold and hunger. The longevity of their monuments, therefore, was mirrored by the longevity they engineered into their most basic resource, proving that to build for eternity, you first had to learn how to make lunch last. The true power of these vast supply chains becomes visible only at their final destination, the carefully planned communities built to house the builders themselves. These were not chaotic labor camps, but organized settlements, miniature cities designed for a single purpose: to efficiently convert state-provided raw materials into the energy of human labor. Archaeological discoveries at places like the workers' village near the Giza plateau and the more extensively documented village of Deir el-Medina offer a stunningly clear window into this final, most human step of the process. Here, the abstract tons of grain and barley recorded on papyrus ledgers were transformed into the warm, tangible reality of daily bread and beer. These villages were the living kitchens of the Megaproject. Excavations reveal a landscape of specialized industry. You would not find families milling their own grain or brewing in their homes. Instead, the state provided centralized, industrial-scale facilities. Large communal bakeries with multiple ovens operated around the clock. At Giza, archaeologists have uncovered entire complexes dedicated to baking, with rows of clay bread molds and vast quantities of ash from constant fires. Next door, in dedicated brewery areas, vats for mashing grain and jars for fermenting beer show a production line for the other staple of the workers' ration. There were centralized areas for butchering fish or the occasional meat ration, and storage magazines for onions, garlic, and dates. This separation of living space from production space is a critical clue. It tells us the food supply was not a private matter, but a state-managed utility, as essential and as regulated as the water supply. The worker did not cook his own meal from ingredients he bought. He received a finished, standardized product, the direct output of the empire's logistical machine. This system offered remarkable efficiency and control. By baking and brewing on site in bulk, the administration minimized waste, ensured consistent quality and portion sizes, and could adjust output precisely to the number of workers present. It also created a self-contained economic ecosystem. The bakers, brewers, and butchers were themselves skilled laborers, paid through the same ration system, creating a community where every role supported the central mission. Walking through the ruins of Deir el-Medina, you can trace the daily rhythm. A worker would finish his shift at the royal tomb and return to the village, stopping not at a market, but at a distribution point. He would present a token, or his identity would be known to the scribe on duty, and he would receive his family's allotment for the day, likely measured loaves of bread and jars of beer, with supplementary items issued on a weekly or monthly schedule. The design of the village itself facilitated this flow. Straight, narrow streets allowed for easy movement, while the placement of the production facilities at a central or accessible point meant no one lived far from their source of sustenance. These communities were, in essence, the human face of the granary system. They were the final, sophisticated mechanism that took the stored potential of last year's harvest and converted it, day after day, into the physical force that moved a 2-ton block of stone. The quiet, domestic archaeology of a broken bread mold or a brewery vat is therefore just as monumental as the pyramid it helped to build, for it captures the precise moment where imperial logistics became human life. This entire empire of food rested on a foundation of information. Behind every full granary and every satisfied worker stood an army of clerks whose weapons were not spears but styluses and brushes. They were the programmers of the ancient world, writing the software that made the physical hardware of boats and storehouses function. In Mesopotamia, this software took a tangible, almost indestructible form, the cuneiform tablet. Imagine a damp slab of clay about the size of your palm, pressed into a neat rectangle. A trained scribe would take a sharp reed and press wedge-shaped marks into its surface, each combination representing a word or a number. Once the record was complete, the tablet would be left to dry in the sun or baked in a kiln, turning it into a permanent data file. These were not epic poems or royal decrees. Most were brutally practical shopping lists for a civilization. They recorded things like, from the city of 500 bushels of barley received, quality good, stored in Granary 7, or issued to the crew of barge number 12, 30 sacks for transport to the construction site at Each tablet was a single transaction, a data point in a sprawling administrative network. Temples and palaces maintained vast archives of these tablets, organized by year, commodity, and official. To find a record, an administrator wouldn't search a scroll, he would lift a physical tablet from a labeled shelf. This system allowed for accountability over incredible distances and time. A provincial governor could be held to his tax quota because the central archive had the receipt. A ship's captain could be questioned about a missing sack because the ledger noted what he was given. The clay tablet transformed promises and obligations into immutable, checkable facts, creating a web of enforced responsibility that stretched across the kingdom. It was a distributed ledger written in mud that made an empire possible. Yet this flow of information and grain required more than just royal decrees. In the earliest civilizations, the line between divine authority and earthly administration was often invisible. The temple was not merely a place of worship, it was the original corporate headquarters, bank, and warehouse, all under one sacred roof. From the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the great temples of Egypt and the pyramid complexes of Mesoamerica, religious institutions operated a parallel and deeply integrated system of food collection and redistribution. This gave the state a powerful, pre-existing network to tap into, a divine supply chain ready for earthly purposes. The principle was simple and universal. Farmers would bring a portion of their harvest to the temple as an offering to the gods or as a required tithe. This was both a spiritual duty and a practical tax. The temple, acting as the deity's earthly estate, would receive and store this immense wealth. Cuneiform records from Mesopotamian city-states like Uruk and Lagash detail this with stunning precision. Tablets list thousands of liters of barley, herds of sheep, and vats of oil flowing into temple storerooms, all meticulously accounted for by temple scribes. This divine storehouse served a critical social function. In times of poor harvest or personal hardship, individuals or families could appeal to the temple for a loan or a grant of food to see them through, creating a community safety net administered by the priest. But the surplus was vast, and it created a reservoir of resources that could be directed toward monumental works, believed to please the very gods who provided the bounty. When a king decided to build a new ziggurat or enlarge a temple complex, he was not starting from scratch. He was activating an existing logistical machine. The temple's granaries were already full. Its scribes were already experts at inventory management. Its network of collectors already reached into the surrounding farmlands. The state project could simply plug into this system, either by commandeering a portion of the temple stores for the workers' rations, or by directing that a share of the annual tithes be sent directly to the royal worksite. In this way, the spiritual economy directly fueled the physical one. The worker building the pyramid believed he was serving the pharaoh, a god-king, and thus his labor was a form of devotion. His daily bread, which may have come from grain offered at a temple, was quite literally a divine gift, looping the entire endeavor back into a cycle of religious obligation and reward. This fusion reached its peak in places like Teotihuacan in Mesoamerica. The vast city, centered on the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, was likely administered as a theocratic state. The temple priesthood would have controlled the distribution of food and goods produced by the surrounding farmlands, using that control to mobilize the labor that built those very pyramids. The system was self-reinforcing and incredibly stable, as it was sanctified by tradition and belief. Challenging the logistical system was not just an act of rebellion, it was an act of impiety. This religious framework provided something pure bureaucracy could not: a deeply ingrained cultural motivation that transformed state requisition into sacred duty. For the farmer, giving his grain to the temple was an act of faith. For the laborer, eating the bread provided by the temple state was an act of participation in a divine plan. The administrative genius of ancient empires was to weave these threads together, creating a tapestry where the spiritual and the logistical were inseparable, and where feeding the masses was always, in some profound way, about feeding the gods. But the ultimate test of a logistical system was not a single, stationary pyramid, but a project that sprawled across the very edge of the known world. The Great Wall of China was not one wall built in one place. It was a shifting, evolving frontier of stone and rammed earth that stretched for thousands of miles across some of Asia's most punishing terrain. Here, the challenge was not just feeding a concentrated workforce, but sustaining a permanent military presence in lands too remote and barren to support them. This was logistics on a geographic scale that defies comprehension, a perpetual crisis of supply where a missed shipment could mean not just a halted project, but a fallen garrison and a breached frontier. The solution demanded a fundamental rethinking of the entire supply model. Instead of relying solely on a river of grain flowing from a distant heartland, Chinese administrators had to make the frontier feed itself. This led to the creation of the Tunshan, or military agricultural colony. These were not just farms, they were fortified settlements where soldier farmers lived with their families. During peacetime or in secure sectors, these troops would lay down their weapons and pick up plows, cultivating the land around their garrison. They grew millet, wheat, and vegetables, and raised livestock, creating a self-sufficient food source right at the point of consumption. This brilliant strategy drastically reduced the crushing burden of long-distance transport. A wall garrison that could produce half its own food needed only half as many caravan trains struggling over mountain passes. The Tunshan system transformed soldiers from pure consumers into producer-defenders, weaving the military presence directly into the local ecology and economy. It turned the wall from a mere barrier into a living, breathing zone of imperial control. Yet even the most fertile frontier valley could not produce everything. The mountainous and arid stretches of the wall, along with the need for specialized goods, tools, and reinforcements for the standing army, meant that the caravan networks never ceased. These were the lifelines, the threads connecting the remote wall to the administrative and agricultural core of the empire. The scale of this overland operation was staggering. Think of thousands of two-wheeled carts pulled by oxen or mules and endless lines of porters snaking their way along narrow, precipitous paths. They carried not only grain and salt, but also iron for tools, cloth for uniforms, arrows by the hundreds of thousands, and communication scrolls from the imperial court. The organization was military in its precision. Way stations were established at one-day travel intervals, providing shelter, fodder, and secure storage. The famous Silk Road routes in many areas doubled as supply corridors for the wall's western sections, their well-traveled paths repurposed for imperial logistics. The cost and difficulty were astronomical. Historical records from the Han and Ming dynasties speak of supply journeys where up to 90% of the grain sent could be consumed by the transporters and their animals before reaching the frontier post. This brutal math meant that feeding one soldier on the wall required the productive effort of many, many farmers back in the interior. It was a system that strained the empire's wealth to its limit, a constant drain on resources justified by the paramount need for security. The Great Wall, therefore, stands as the purest expression of logistical will. Its true foundation was not stone, but the relentless, grinding effort of those caravans and the sun-baked fields of the soldier farmers. It was a megaproject that could never be finished because its supply chain was a perpetual motion machine, a cycle of planting, harvesting, and hauling that had to continue for centuries. The wall was not just a line on a map, it was a slow-moving river of sustenance, flowing forever toward the edge of empire. This cycle of mutual dependence was perhaps perfected in the world's very first cities. In the sun-baked plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians and Akkadians faced a paradox. Their survival depended on a miracle of engineering, the vast network of irrigation canals that diverted river water to their fields, transforming desert into lush, productive farmland. This system created the agricultural surplus that made urban life and monumental building possible. Yet that same system was incredibly fragile, constantly threatened by silt, floods, and collapse. Maintaining it required an army of laborers, thousands of canal diggers working under the blazing sun, and feeding that army required the very surplus that the canals produced. Here, the logistical loop was not just efficient, it was existential. The temple and the palace, often one and the same in early Mesopotamia, sat at the center of this perfect circle. They collected the grain and dates grown on the irrigated temple estates. This bounty filled the temple granaries, which were not just spiritual storehouses but the operational capital of the state. When the canals began to clog with silt after the annual floods, threatening the next season's harvest, the temple administrators would open those granaries. They would issue rations to mobilize a workforce of thousands, who would then spend weeks or months dredging, repairing, and expanding the very waterways that would refill the granaries the following year. It was a closed, self-reinforcing system. The food surplus enabled the labor, and the labor maintained the system that created the food surplus. This interdependence is etched into the earliest written records we have. Cuneiform tablets from the city of Lagash, dating back over 4,000 years, detail the exact rations issued to these canal workers. They received barley, the staple grain, along with oil and wool for clothing, all measured out from the temple stores. The records are meticulous, noting the names of overseers, the lengths of canal sections cleared, and the duration of the work. This was not occasional community service. It was a state-managed, large-scale industrial operation, scheduled with the precision of a modern public works department. The labor itself was organized through a corvée system, a form of required public service that every able-bodied citizen owed to the temple and the king. For a period each year, farmers would leave their own fields to work on the canals or on construction projects, sustained by the collective food reserve. This system powered more than just maintenance. The same administrative machine and the same ration-fueled workforce that maintained the canals could be redirected to build the towering ziggurats that defined the Mesopotamian skyline. These step temples, reaching toward the heavens, were physical manifestations of the city's gratitude to the gods for the life-giving water. So the canal digger and the ziggurat builder were often the same person, paid from the same source, performing two sides of the same sacred duty, sustaining the body and the spirit of the civilization. The entire society was built on this reciprocal bargain, a grand bargain between the people, their rulers, and their gods. The individual contributed their labor to the communal infrastructure, and in return, the temple state guaranteed their sustenance and their connection to the divine. This early model demonstrates the fundamental truth that emerged in every empire we have explored. Monumental achievement was never just about commanding labor. It was about mastering the cycle of energy, directing the fruits of the land back into the hands that shaped the land itself. Yet this delicate balance of grain and power was terrifyingly fragile. For all their ingenuity, ancient empires walked a razor's edge. The entire monumental enterprise, from the grandest pyramid to the humblest worker's daily bread, depended on a chain of perfect conditions. A single broken link, whether from the sky, human hands, or the land itself, could unravel everything. When the distribution system failed, the consequences were immediate, brutal, and far-reaching, transforming sites of creation into theaters of crisis. The most common and devastating trigger was climate. A series of low Nile floods in Egypt or a prolonged drought in the Mesopotamian plains meant the harvests that filled the state granaries simply never materialized. This was not a minor shortfall, it was a direct attack on the empire's operational capital. Without that incoming river of grain, the carefully calculated ration system at remote work sites would begin to starve. The first signs of trouble were not riots but a quiet, creeping dread. Rations would be reduced, their quality diluted with chaff or inferior grain. The beer might grow weaker, the fish ration might disappear entirely. For the laborer whose entire world was defined by that predictable daily allotment, this was more than hunger. It was a broken promise, a signal that the covenant with the state had been severed. A hungry workforce is a static one. Productivity would plummet as weakness set in. Then the protests would begin. We have direct evidence of this from rare but profound moments in the historical record. During the reign of Ramesses III in Egypt, the workers at the royal necropolis in Deir el-Medina, the very artisans we discussed, did something extraordinary. Their grain rations were delayed, likely due to administrative failures or corruption somewhere up the chain. These were not slaves but respected state employees. They organized what is considered one of the first recorded strikes in history. They laid down their tools, walked out of the sacred valley, and staged a sit-in at a nearby temple, demanding their rightful pay in grain. Their cry, preserved on papyrus, was simple and powerful: "We are hungry." The state, utterly dependent on their skilled labor, was forced to negotiate and deliver the owed rations. This event reveals the latent power held by those at the end of the supply chain. Their collective action could halt the very projects that defined pharaonic glory. But such organized protest was a best-case scenario. In larger, more remote labor camps filled with conscripted workers, the outcome of a breakdown was often chaos. Without food, discipline evaporated. Workers might simply abandon the site in a desperate scramble to return home, leaving half-finished monuments as silent skeletons. In extreme cases, hunger could boil over into violence against overseers or the looting of what little store remained, fragmenting the community into a desperate, every person for themselves struggle. This localized collapse at a project site was a direct blow to royal prestige. A halted pyramid was a visible, undeniable symbol of a faltering god-king, a crack in the facade of divine order. Yet the true existential threat occurred when the failure was not local but systemic. If drought or corruption crippled the central distribution network that fed entire cities, like Rome's Annona, the scale of crisis multiplied exponentially. The philosopher King Marcus Aurelius faced this nightmare in the late 2nd century. A combination of plague, which devastated the agricultural workforce, and military conflicts that disrupted shipping, led to severe grain shortages in Rome. The city's million mouths still needed to be fed. As shipments faltered, the price of what little grain remained on the open market skyrocketed. Panic spread through the crowded tenements. The peaceful, dependent relationship fostered by the Annona turned toxic. The populace who saw the emperor as their provider now saw him as their betrayer. Bread riots erupted, statues of the emperor were torn down. The very social stability the system was built to ensure evaporated into anger and violence in the streets. This urban unrest forced the state to divert immense resources, often pulling troops from vital frontiers to restore order, further weakening the empire's overall security. Corruption within the administrative class itself could be as destructive as any drought. A provincial governor might siphon off grain destined for a worksite to sell for personal profit. A scribe might falsify records to hide theft. A ship's captain might sell part of his cargo on the black market, reporting it lost to river pirates. Each small act of graft created a deficit somewhere down the line, a deficit that would eventually manifest as empty bellies at a critical project or garrison. When workers or soldiers discovered their hardship was due not to fate, but to the greed of a distant official, their anger became focused and politically charged. It eroded trust in the entire bureaucratic system, the very system that held a geographically vast empire together. In the end, the failure of mass food distribution was never just a logistical problem, it was a crisis of legitimacy. It demonstrated that the state could not uphold its most basic function, the provision of security and sustenance. When the grain stopped flowing, the authority of the king, the pharaoh, or the emperor bled away with it, proving that the true mortar holding ancient empires together was not fear or ideology, but the consistent daily delivery of a simple loaf of bread. Across these sprawling empires, a single, universal blueprint never existed. The shape of their supply chains was carved by the land itself, revealing a fascinating spectrum of solutions to the same relentless problem. Egypt's model was a linear, riverine lifeline. Everything depended on the predictable pulse of the Nile, a single, dominant highway that collected grain from the fertile delta and channeled it with serene efficiency to a fixed point, whether a pyramid site or the capital at Memphis. The system was elegant and centralized, like a tree with one thick trunk and many small branches, all flowing in one direction. Rome's approach was a maritime web. It looked not inward to a single river, but outward to an entire sea. The Annona transformed the Mediterranean into a Roman lake with multiple sources, Egypt and North Africa, feeding a single, ravenous destination, the city of Rome. This was a system of redundancy and naval power, relying on wind, wave, and a vast fleet to create a flexible, multi-threaded lifeline that could withstand a crisis in one province. Then, in the Andes, the Inca confronted a world where wheels and large ships were impossible. Their answer was a terrestrial network of staggering complexity. Instead of a central river or sea, they built a central nervous system, the Qullqas road network, connecting a decentralized array of thousands of mountain storehouses, the qullqas. Their system was not a river flowing to a point, but a web holding up a territory, distributing risk across countless valleys and altitudes. The contrast is illuminating. Egypt moved a lot of food along one reliable route to a few mega-projects. Rome moved a colossal amount of food across open water to one mega-city. The Inca moved manageable amounts of food across countless trails to countless small nodes, sustaining an empire across vertical geography. Each empire mastered its own environment, proving that the genius of ancient logistics was not in inventing one perfect system, but in adapting the principle of centralized distribution to the stubborn, beautiful realities of mountain, river, and sea. Behind every stone mason and canal digger stood a silent, indispensable army. While we marvel at the monuments, we rarely consider the countless hands whose entire purpose was not to build the wonder itself, but simply to keep the builders alive. This was the invisible labor, the vast secondary economy that existed solely to fuel the primary one. For every worker lifting a block at Giza, there was a farmer along the Nile whose harvest was destined for the royal granary instead of his local market. There was a miller grinding that grain into flour from dawn until dusk, his millstone turning to the rhythm of state demand. There were teams of bakers working in shifts in soot-filled bakeries, their world defined by the endless cycle of mixing, molding, and firing thousands of identical loaves. Next to them, brewers managed vats of fermenting mash, their skill ensuring the nutritional beer ration was consistent and safe. These roles were not casual side jobs, they were specialized, full-time professions created and sustained by the Megaprojects' endless appetite. Their work created a ripple effect that stretched across the kingdom. Down at the river docks, a separate class of laborers sprang to life. Boat builders and shipwrights worked in royal shipyards, constructing and repairing the fleet of barges that were the system's arteries. The boatmen who piloted these vessels were essential state employees, navigating the Nile's currents with precious cargo, their knowledge of the river as critical as any engineer's knowledge of stone. When the grain reached its overland jump point, cartwrights maintained the wooden wagons and frames, while teamsters managed the trains of donkeys or oxen. These animals themselves required support, leading to fodder growers and veterinarians dedicated to keeping the transport corps healthy and moving. Along every lonely desert trail or mountain pass, guards were posted, not to watch over treasure, but to protect the mundane, vital sacks of grain from bandits or spoilage. Their vigilance ensured that the calories produced with so much effort reached their final destination. This supporting caste lived in a world defined by routine and precision. The baker did not decide how much bread to make each day. He received a quota based on the official workforce count. The boat captain did not choose his cargo or destination. He followed a shipping order issued by a scribe in a distant office. Their lives were interlocked with the administrative machine, their success measured by their ability to meet the system's relentless, predictable demands. Their communities often grew directly around the logistical nodes, creating towns whose identity was tied to a single function: a port town full of sailors and dockworkers, or a garrison settlement whose sole reason for existence was to protect a supply route. This specialization created a form of early mass production, long before the industrial age. The constant, high-volume demand for standardized rations like bread and beer encouraged efficiency and consistency, pushing these supporting crafts toward a kind of proto-industrial scale. Yet their contribution, though foundational, often left little personal trace in the archaeological record. We find the grand tombs of architects and high priests, but the final resting place of the head brewer for the Great Pyramid workforce is lost to time. Their names are absent from the victory steles and royal annals. Their legacy is collective and anonymous, woven into the fabric of the achievement itself. When we look at a perfectly cut stone in an ancient wall, we are seeing not just the cutter's skill, but the accumulated effort of the farmer who grew the grain, the miller who ground it, the baker who baked it, and the guard who watched over its journey. That stone is a monument to them all. This layered economy reveals a profound truth about these ancient societies. Their ability to mobilize labor was not limited to a single project, but was a pervasive force that could reorganize entire sectors of production, redirecting the energy of thousands toward a single, consuming goal, simply to make other, even grander work possible. These intricate systems of supply did not vanish without a trace. The physical evidence they left behind is scattered across the world, a puzzle of stone, clay, and bone waiting to be pieced together by archaeologists. Each fragment tells a different part of the story, from the grand scale of storage to the intimate details of a worker's last meal. The most imposing clues are the ruins of the granaries themselves. In Egypt, the mud brick foundations of massive, dome-shaped silos still mark the landscape near ancient administrative centers. Their circular footprints and thick walls speak directly to their purpose: preservation and security on a state level. At Roman ports like Ostia, the skeletal remains of the Horia, with their rows of small, vaulted rooms and raised floors for ventilation, clearly outline a logistics hub designed for throughput and control. These structures are the fossilized hearts of the distribution network, their very architecture a record of imperial priorities. Then we have the written records, the voices of the administrators. In Mesopotamia, the humble cuneiform tablet is a time capsule of a single transaction. One might list the delivery of 500 measures of barley from a named village, received by a specific official on a certain date. Another might be a ration list for a crew of 20 canal cleaners, detailing their daily allotment of grain and oil for a month. These are not grand histories, they are the bureaucratic paperwork of empire, and they provide an astonishingly precise ledger of how the system functioned day to day. In Egypt, Ostraca, those recycled pottery shards used as notepads offer similar snapshots. A scribe at Deir el-Medina might jot down that the carpenter Amenem was absent from work due to illness, and thus his family's grain ration for that day was reduced accordingly. This granular detail reveals the system's relentless accounting, reaching into the lives of every individual it supported. But some of the most telling evidence comes not from grand buildings or official records, but from the garbage heaps of history. The refuse pits of worker villages are archaeological treasure troves. Here, researchers sift through layers of discarded animal bones, broken pottery, and food remnants. The bones tell a vivid story. A high proportion of fish bones, especially from Nile catfish and perch, confirms the written accounts of a fish-based protein ration. The cuts and butchering marks on cattle or sheep bones show how meat, when it was provided, was efficiently divided into standard portions. Even the age of the animals at the time they were consumed offers clues. A prevalence of older animals might indicate they were past their prime for milk or wool, and thus diverted to the state ration system. The broken pottery, often seen as mere trash, is equally eloquent. Thousands of identical, mass-produced bread molds found at Giza testify to the industrial scale of baking. Standardized beer jars, all of the same size and shape, point to a centralized brewing and distribution system. The wear patterns on cooking pots can suggest the types of gruels or stews that supplemented the daily bread. This assemblage of everyday debris paints a surprisingly complete picture of the worker's diet, its variety, its limitations, and its remarkable consistency over time. Yet for all this evidence, enormous gaps remain in our understanding, shaped by the most fundamental force of all, decay. The central commodity itself, the grain, the bread, the dried fish, has almost entirely perished. We can infer its presence from the silos that held it and the records that tracked it, but we rarely find the actual substance. This is a profound silence in the archaeological record. We know the Inca stored freeze-dried potatoes by the ton in their qullqas, but the potatoes themselves are long gone, leaving only the empty, ventilated storehouses on the hillsides. We have the shipping manifests for Roman grain fleets, but not a single kernel from those shipments survives in the holds of sunken ships, having been consumed by time and sea creatures. The organic containers are also lost, the woven reed baskets, the leather sacks, the wooden barrels that carried so much of this material. They have returned to the earth, leaving us to guess at their exact design and capacity. This perishable nature of the system's core components forces historians to work from the outlines, from the negative space. We see the shape of the granary and deduce what must have filled it. We read the ration list and imagine the weight of the loaf. We study the bone and pottery patterns to reconstruct the meal that once surrounded them. These gaps are a humbling reminder. The monumental stone endures, but the fragile, vital system that fed its creation is far more elusive, surviving only in fragments and echoes. It challenges us to listen more carefully to those echoes, to read the silent testimony of a broken bread mold or an empty storage bin, and to understand that sometimes the most important history is written not in what remains, but in what was carefully, systematically consumed. The silent efficiency of those ancient supply chains forces a profound shift in perspective. For generations, we viewed pre-industrial societies through a lens of simplicity, picturing them as collections of villages led by charismatic rulers who commanded monuments through sheer force of will. The reality uncovered by ledgers, granaries, and ration lists is far more sophisticated. These were not simple societies that occasionally built big things. They were highly organized states whose very existence was predicated on managing mind-boggling complexity. The ability to plan not for a season but for decades, to coordinate the actions of farmers, sailors, scribes, and bakers across hundreds of miles, all without digital communication or mechanized transport, represents a pinnacle of human administrative genius. It reveals a world where abstract thinking, mathematics, and long-term strategy were applied to the most concrete of problems, feeding people. This reframes our entire understanding of their capabilities. The pyramid is not the outlier, it is the ultimate proof of a system that was already functioning at an extraordinary level every single day. The monument is the exclamation mark at the end of a sentence written in grain. When we look at the empty sockets of a Roman horrea or the straight lines of an Inca road, we are not looking at primitive ruins, we are looking at the physical infrastructure of a complex, data-driven civilization. Their mastery was in creating resilient networks that could absorb shocks and maintain flow, a lesson that feels strikingly modern. In fact, there is a direct, if cautious, parallel to be drawn between these ancient systems and the global supply chains that power our world today. The core problems have not changed, only the tools we use to solve them. Then, as now, the fundamental challenge is one of moving a resource from a point of production to a point of need, across space and time, while minimizing loss and maximizing efficiency. The pharaoh's administrators worried about the silt levels in the Nile affecting barge traffic, just as a modern logistics manager monitors port congestion and rail schedules. The Inca qullqas tracking inventory in scattered qullqas was performing the same essential function as a warehouse management system, updating a cloud database in real time. Both systems are fundamentally about information, the accurate, timely data that allows a planner to make decisions. The Mesopotamian temple scribe ensuring a canal crew received their exact barley ration was enforcing accountability and quality control, principles that are the bedrock of any modern manufacturing or distribution operation. The Roman Annona, with its reliance on diverse sourcing from Egypt and North Africa to ensure security, is a classic study in supply chain redundancy, a strategy every major corporation employs to avoid being crippled by a disruption in one region. Even the worker village bakery, producing a standardized loaf for thousands, mirrors the concept of centralized production and just-in-time delivery to a point of use. Of course, the scale and speed are incomparable. A message that took weeks by runner moves in milliseconds today. A grain shipment that filled a barge for a month-long journey now fits in a single container crossing an ocean in days. But the underlying logic, the relentless focus on solving the triad of storage, transport, and allocation, is eerily familiar. Studying these ancient networks does more than deepen our respect for the past. It holds up a mirror to our own world. It reminds us that our complex, interconnected global system is not an unprecedented invention of the digital age, but the latest iteration of a very old human endeavor, the struggle to tame distance, scarcity, and time through the power of organization. In their silent stones and faded clay tablets, we see the blueprint for our own world, a testament to the enduring human need to connect, to provide, and to build beyond the horizon of a single harvest. Yet for all the evidence, profound mysteries linger at the edges of our understanding. The sheer scale of ancient logistics is clear, but the precise human details remain hotly debated, a reminder that history is not a solved equation but an ongoing conversation. One of the most persistent questions surrounds the exact size of the workforce. While we have estimates for the Great Pyramid ranging from 20,000 to 30,000, these figures are extrapolated from the size of the tomb, the likely construction timeline, and the capacity of the nearby worker village. There is no ancient payroll sheet that lists every single laborer by name. This uncertainty opens a door to wider debates. If the workforce was smaller but worked over a longer period, the daily logistical burden changes. Could a smaller, permanent crew of specialists have achieved the same result with a less frantic supply chain? Or does the archaeological evidence of the large bakeries and breweries at Giza itself argue for a truly massive, concentrated population? Each interpretation paints a slightly different picture of Egyptian society and its capabilities. Similarly, The exact routes of overland supply caravans for projects far from rivers are often educated guesses. We know the grain arrived, but tracing the specific paths across thousands of years of shifting sand and erosion is incredibly difficult. Did they follow a single, well-trodden road or multiple, shifting trails to avoid difficult terrain or political trouble? The answer would tell us much about the state's control over the hinterlands and its ability to secure remote corridors. These are not just academic quibbles, they shape our perception of how these empires truly functioned on the ground. Perhaps the most sensitive and complex debate revolves around the nature of the labor itself. The old image of masses of slaves being whipped into construction is largely dismissed by modern scholars, but what replaced it is nuanced. Evidence points overwhelmingly to a rotational system, a form of national service. In Egypt, it was likely the corvée, where farmers would contribute a period of labor to the state during the inundation season when their fields were flooded. In the Inca Empire, the mitre system required communities to send a portion of their able-bodied men to work on state projects for a set time each year. This was compulsory, a tax paid in labor, but it was typically temporary and structured. Workers were compensated with those standardized rations, and in some cases, like at Deir el-Medina, they could even stage protests for better pay, which slaves could not do. This suggests a relationship more complex than simple coercion. It was a reciprocal obligation, a duty to the state that provided security and divine favor in return. Yet the line between duty and compulsion is thin. How voluntary was it for a farmer conscripted from a distant village? Was there a realistic way to refuse? The experience likely varied dramatically based on one's social status, the project, and the era. A skilled artisan might have enjoyed relative privilege and job security, while a laborer dredging canals under the sun might have felt the weight of the state's demand much more heavily. The truth probably existed on a spectrum, blending civic duty, religious devotion, social pressure, and the state's ultimate power to command. These unanswered questions are not failures of research but invitations. They remind us that the past is not a static diorama, but a living field of study where each new discovery, a previously unread papyrus, a satellite image revealing a lost trail, can reshape the narrative. The ongoing debates ensure our understanding of these ancient supply chains remains dynamic, pushing us to look closer at the evidence and to listen more carefully to the silent testimony of stones, seeds, and bones. The true legacy of these silent supply chains is a revolution in how we see the ancient world. We have long stood in awe of the stone, marveling at the engineering that lifted blocks into the sky. But the deeper, more human achievement was the system that lifted the bread to the builder's hand. These megaprojects were, at their core, dual triumphs. The visible one was in engineering, a testament to human ingenuity with lever and ramp. The invisible and arguably more profound triumph was in administration, a testament to human ingenuity with ledger and ledger. To manage mass food distribution on such a scale required a holistic, empire-wide organism. It was not a single clever trick, but an integrated cycle that began with the tax collector in a farmer's field and ended with the baker handing a warm loaf to a worker at dawn. Every step was a link in a chain of dependency. Taxation gathered the surplus, storage preserved it across time, transport conquered distance, and daily rationing converted it directly into labor. This cycle turned the chaotic abundance of nature into a predictable, deployable resource. The energy of the sun and soil transformed into the energy of human muscle. This represents one of the earliest and most sophisticated forms of large-scale organization our species ever devised. It was a kind of social technology, an operating system for civilization that allowed thousands to coordinate toward a single goal, not through chaotic force but through meticulous, sustained planning. They built networks of trust and accountability long before they built walls of stone. When we look at the quiet remains of a granary or the careful notations on a clay tablet, we are not looking at peripheral details, we are looking at the foundational logic of empire itself. The monuments that scrape the sky are merely the most durable receipts, the final proof of purchase for an unimaginable quantity of bread, beer, and human coordination. They remind us that before a society could alter the landscape, it first had to master the art of the meal.